Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. This is your host, Robert Stanley. Today we'll be answering a conspiracy theorist question. Tyler Clatenoff asks, is history fake? That question is vehemently answered by Mark Warren, a history teacher, and an anthropology student, Marissa Alexa McCool, author of the following: False Start, Lesbian Purple Space Rainbow Mermaid Queen, Shiny New Science Vagina, Silent Dreams, a series of essays and poems from a public trans girl, The PC Lie, How American Voters Decided I Don't Matter, Passing Cars, Voice in the Dark, and Once Unspoken. She also hosts the Queersplaining podcast and a blog at rimschool.com. A very busy lady. All these links are in today's show notes. It's time to challenge the record of time itself. And I had no idea it would get this heated.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
My name is Tyler Clatenoff. I'm a thinker and a researcher and a diehard skeptic about everything, including what we learned in school. And I've been recently doing a lot of research about mud flood research and what people are calling tartaria. And it turns out, and it seems pretty obvious to me now, that history is completely fake. If you want to find me, just feel free to add me on Facebook, and I post a lot of interesting things there too.
I'm Mark Warren. I teach 8th grade world history, specifically early world history, so really until about the Renaissance.
My name is Marissa Alexa McCool. I'm a graduate student in the Twin Cities, an 8-time published author, and host of various podcasts. And you can find me by putting my name into any search engine on a podcast or Amazon.com.
You can just see so many examples of them being wrong with it, and it puts it all into question.
No, it doesn't. Just because it's hard for you to understand does not mean it's fake.
It's funny to me that your historical theory on the fact that history is false is named after something that has been proven in history to be abject bullshit.
There are cities that have just entire, it's like a whole city was just covered like in a foot, like one story of mud, and you can...
It is absolutely absurd to insult us that way, to think that we are so blinded by this cult of academia, and using even George Carlin to quote it as if he would believe someone who says the earth is flat and outer space isn't real 300 years ago as well. So I'm failing. Please stop interrupting me.
So I feel like I haven't gotten to talk much at all here, but sorry, continue.
Okay, you can wait your turn. Just like I have, just like Mark has. You can wait until we're finished to speak, just like the rest of us do.
Yes, ma'am, sorry.
Do you believe the earth is flat? Yes or no?
I think it's more of a realm. I don't think it has a shape.
Where's your proof?
Oh, deity.
What?
Tyler, would you also say that you do not believe that space is real?
I do not believe in outer space, no.
There is absolutely no proof. You're saying obvious lies, but you're not giving any
Ma'am,
concrete...
please don't call me a liar. There is definitely proof.
Excuse me, if you interrupt me one more time, I am leaving this call.
Call me a liar.
I did not call you a liar.
This is Tyler Clatenoff.
This is Marissa Alexa McCool.
This is Mark Warren, and you are listening to
The Right to Reason. Please be reasonable about thinking about everything, even the historical record.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
Derek Hawk, you make atheist apparel. You can be found at teespring.com/doors/killahawk1-store-2. That's a long link, but guess what, everybody? You can find it in today's show notes. Derek, so happy to be talking to you today.
Hey, buddy, how you doing?
I'm fantastic, man. So you make, what, T-shirts or something?
So, yeah, I just started this as a little, trying to make a little bit of uniqueness into when we go out and advocate for our stance. I'm a huge fan of the old 70s Alien movie. So this is what I styled my shirts and my statements by. So each of the three major main Alien movies has a atheist-themed transformation of each. I put a lot of work in this, made it look as nice as I could, and I think everybody will really enjoy wearing these things.
What was the third one, where the alien like came out of her tummy, like as she's falling into the lava or something like? The first one was Alien, then Aliens, and then what was the third one?
Alien 3.
What, seriously?
I'm serious.
I could not have predicted that. Okay, so either way, find this guy's stuff. Mr. Hawk, so happy to talk to you today.
So happy to be there too.
So today we are joined by Marissa, Mark, and Tyler. I want to bring up some points about history. That's the question that we're talking about today. Is history real? We were taught that Isaac Newton had an apple fall on his head and he discovered gravity. That was silly and false. Russia was actually the primary reason that World War II ended and the Germans were defeated. They even conquered Manchuria, which happened before we bombed Japan. Vietnam didn't attack the United States in the Gulf of Tonkin. It was actually the United States that shot one of our own ships. Some of the moon landing had fake footage as an effort to push back against Russia during the Cold War, even though we did go to the moon. Tyler may disagree. The rebel flag is not actually the same flag that people fly today. Christopher Columbus circled the globe, but he didn't prove that Earth was flat. Generations before us argued that weed was dangerous to us, that it would make us, my own father even said, it made people in his time jump off of their high schools because they thought they could fly. Weed made people think
right here. That's bullshit.
Right, exactly. Christmas wasn't Jesus's birth, even based on the Bible. Another part from the Bible, Easter, is based on Ishtar, a pagan ritual. There's lots of things that history got wrong. Today, Tyler Clatenoff will be going head-to-head with an anthropologist and a history teacher about whether or not history is fake. Tyler, can you start us off?
Yeah, so someone pointed out to me that perhaps all the state capitol buildings are state capitol buildings because they were already here. And I was about 2 years ago now, someone proposed the idea that perhaps some of the buildings were already here, which goes completely against what we're told, because we're told that Christopher Columbus came and there were just Indians here. But
like Thanksgiving, like we were told, like
pilgrims and
a lot of
the peaceful sit down between pilgrims and Native
Right.
Americans, and we split the first turkey and we learned how to use fish heads in the soil to grow better crops with them. Yeah,
They taught us how to make corn. Sure. But Tyler, you're saying that like the structures of our past weren't made in our past, or that like we couldn't make them today?
I'm saying that maybe when they got here, when Christopher Columbus landed, the DC Capitol building and much of the Capitol buildings were already here. And then so we just lied and said we built them and just killed all the Indians that knew it was already here.
What?
Can we
Then
stop calling
perhaps-
them Indians, please?
Sorry, Native Americans.
Fair enough. That's a good point.
The actual natives that were living here, perhaps that is part of the reason we were so not nice to them and completely obliterated so much of their culture and history, was because they knew stuff. Maybe some Freemasons just found some Freemasonry. And just when you look at DC and the World's Fairs, and Salt Lake and San Francisco specifically, just the official story is just so absurd. So much was built before electricity. They tell us that horses with wagons, people with horses and wagons had these just giant, marble pillars. They tell us it's brick coated in marble, but I don't know. I think that they're just lying about all of it. Someone pointed out that maybe it's all here. And once you start looking at it that way, yeah, it seems that history is completely fake and all the buildings are already here.
Wow, I'm convinced. Let's sign it off right now.
Okay.
So, let me just ask, for comedy and TV's sake, we're not stating that the aliens did it, right?
We don't know. We're stating that
Jesus,
what we're
Tyler.
told What we're saying is what we're told is not accurate. It wasn't
Okay.
settlers with wagons. And we don't know what actually did it. Not ruling anything out. I don't think it was aliens, but maybe. We don't know.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. Would you like a historian perspective or anthropological perspective first?
No, Mark, we don't have time for that today. So we're just kidding.
The
No, go
main
ahead.
the main thing I would hoping that one of you guys could help me with is how the sandstone and marble was cut and hauled and quarried before electricity, and like how the logistical details of how they would make sandstone under masonry that connects almost all of DC. Do you guys know much about that part? The actual how they built this so much before electricity?
Well, I mean, we can go back as far as, pyramids, which I suppose would be one of the great, miracles of the early world that I'm familiar with teaching about. So that would be a strength for me to discuss. And some concepts with that would be everything. And granted, I mean, there is a lot in the history books that is absolutely unequivocally misstated. Now, that is not to say that I agree that history is on its premise false. I think that history is one of those things you can demonstrate. You were talking about in the intro several correlations between the wars that the United States has been involved with. I mean, you can trace, really the war on terror back all the way to Gavrilo Princip on June 28th of 1914, pulling the trigger on 2 people in Sarajevo. World War I, the cessation of it not being resolved led to World War II, which led to the Cold War. So you see progression happening in history that is traceable, whether you can see it in pictures or not. You can trace it through events.
The whole thing, though, not to interrupt for 1 second, though.
No,
I'm aware of the whole official story of history, but that itself is being called. Perhaps history was completely reset from scratch in like 1800. We don't really know.
But we have documents older than that have been verified and cross-examined. That's part of the thing. The basis of what convinced you so far, at least that I've heard, is someone told me. And in no academic study that I've ever been in has someone told me.
To some structures there.
Excuse me. Please don't interrupt me.
Well, you said something that was not quite true. It wasn't just that someone told me.
That's how you stated it. You said, someone told me this, and I thought it was there. So,
Okay, I guess I misspoke that, and I'm sorry.
Sorry, no, it's cool, Tyler. I want to hear what Marissa has to say.
I've studied history, but I am by no means a history expert. I have more of a focus in anthropology, which is the study of people. And I can't call myself an anthropologist because I haven't done field work, but I did study anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, which is a top 10 university, and I place great value in the pedagogy that I learned from the people there. And, we're talking about 1800 being a starting point, and that's silly because natives were here as long as 12,000 years before Columbus set foot in the Dominican area in Hispaniola. And, the Incans built pyramids, the Mayans built pyramids. This is not something that only came into being because Columbus came or because the Pilgrims came. And what I feel is being called into question, at least in the intro, is the elementary school or even high school version of history. But as people who have even taken 101 in college know, pretty much when you get to college, you figure out that history books are paid for by the state and not by historians. And we're taught a lot of happy whitewashing myths that override a lot of what actually happened. But the sources are there. The books are there. The primary sources are there. It's not history that teaches that. It's popular culture and myth and whitewashed education that waters it down for something that won't offend white parents a lot, especially in Texas.
Marissa, you're claiming that history might not be accurate based on racism, white supremacy, and Tyler seems to be claiming that history might not be accurate based on, and forgive me, Tyler, if this isn't accurate, but the powers that be, as it were. Could it be possible that you two might agree on more than you think you do?
Seems so to me. Seems like there's a sliding scale between how much history is manipulated and fabricated, and we can all agree there's at least some of it, and perhaps history goes as far as being completely made up from scratch, like in the 1800s, on the other side, and I'm more and more leaning toward that side.
Let's go with old people. Who's the oldest person you know?
My grandma's 100. I talk to her a lot still.
Right, 100. Okay, so that put her born in what, 1917, 1919, between that range, somewhere in there?
Yeah.
Okay, so her great-grandparent, even, going with age reductions over time back and, people died younger, etc. Her grandparent was likely alive in early 1800s, yes?
Yeah,
Yeah, probably so. So go back one more generation, and we're talking early 1800s, if not late 1700s. Do you not have a family tree further back than that many generations yourself that you trust? I mean, do you trust your own people? Or is this, how far does this mistrust go? Because again, even as a history teacher, I agree with what was just said from both other parties. The state taught version of history is just that. It's what the powers that be want you to know and how they want you to know it. But as was stated, anyone past a 101 college education in history or anthropology, most likely, as I've shared some of those classes happily as well. What is with 1800? Like, did a plague happen I wasn't aware of?
I was wondering that too. What is the significance?
Like around 1817-ish, just 1812, just lots of, all over the world, there was something big in the early 1800s.
Name some of them.
Yeah. Really. That's fascinating that this particular time had so much significance in our history, or the lack thereof.
So if I can jump in there, once again, I don't think history is fake. I think that the primary education teaching of history is very flawed. And anthropology even isn't taught until college. So you start from a basis there, if you even start at all. I'm approaching this much more from that point of view, despite having some background in history, which is based on a lot of thorough research in 4 different fields of anthropology. And it goes way further back than 1800, even though the terms weren't exactly popularized until the 19th century. But if we're talking 1800, we're talking things like revolutions and the arguments over when slave trade should end and the War of 1812, and never mind the fact that most of the natives were wiped out long before that because of the transference of diseases that were carried over from the world. So it just seems an odd place to start, because there's no period in recorded history or otherwise where a lot of stuff wasn't happening. So it seems weird to focus on that specific time.
You can trace back syphilis in Europe to the return of New World crews, which far predates 1800s. So again, well, I guess that doesn't explain the reset, but there is, as everyone else has said, documentable history far enough back that, again, this just seems a bit of a fallacy.
Just hypothetically here. So if, let's just say, the existence of Alexander the Great would be called into question, would you guys all agree that he was definitely a real person?
Born in 357 BCE, yeah.
So assuming, hypothetically, Alexander the Great might just be a cover story to mask that all these buildings are already here by some old civilization, what would you say to someone who doesn't believe in Alexander the Great? How would you prove to them that he was actually a real person and that maybe these buildings are just a lot older than they say and they came up with a story? What would you say about that? Are you at least open to that idea?
First of all, the onus isn't on the people who are already in the field to prove what is already accepted. It's not on...
You accepted it. I didn't accept it.
I didn't say you accepted it. I said those who study this have accepted it.
Yeah, but what if it's not true?
What's your proof? The burden of proof is not on us.
Well, the proof is because at least some of these buildings were already here.
Would you please stop interrupting me?
You asked what my proof was, and I'm sorry to answer your question. Continue.
No, I'm good. Mark?
What is it here that you are trying to prove to us? I mean, that you don't believe. I mean, it's kind of like religion here, man. Like, I can tell you what I know on my side of it, but I can't make you believe on your side unless you're willing to see the light. And I'm not a religious guy, but that's as close as I can get here with what we both assume, and not to speak for the host, but I think the three of us assume is the deity of choices given truth here. So you were asking about Alexander the Great. Okay, let's tell you for a second why I believe, and that's because I use reference points through history. Alexander the Great left his mark both in writing and being written about. He He was then spoken of and recorded being spoken of by writers who recorded Julius Caesar, who was then quoted in Shakespeare in the mid-1500s, writing a history play, granted, theater, but history mixed. You can, you can divide the two out. You can see where is what and what's what. And then all the way up till now, we get shitty movies made about him. And people aren't going to spend millions of dollars to hire pretty boy actors to play terrible, poorly written roles unless they thought that they were going to make money on it, which means everybody in the world has heard of this dude enough that they're going to want to go and see a movie called Alexander.
What does a Macedonian warlord have to do with buildings being in North America?
He was too busy traveling around killing folks to build much of anything other than an empire that fell apart right after he died.
Maybe he didn't even exist, though, is what we're talking about right now.
Maybe the aliens brought it.
No.
Let me jump in real quick. Okay, so Tyler, just to clarify, your argument is that which we understand of history is false. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that it's the full of what I'm saying right now is that there are at least some buildings that were already here, and that kind of destroys the mainstream narrative of history.
Okay.
Such as the sandstone under masonry of the DC Capitol buildings, and all the star forts, like at the Statue of Liberty, that seems modern, but then the star fort, the stone structure that she's standing on or he's standing on, that seems like it was already here. You guys should really...
Old-looking neighborhood right down the street. There's an antebellum house getting rebuilt right now. Looks like 1900s at the newest, but damn if it doesn't have electricity inside. You know what I'm saying? Things are made to look old so they can look old. It doesn't mean that they are old.
Tyler,
maybe they are old.
You're talking to someone that has a degree in anthropology, someone that not only has a degree in history, but also teaches history currently, vocationally. And you are challenging these two people, saying that you have more knowledge about these points than they do. That you're taking a very, I don't want to use the word arrogant, because I've talked to you many times. You're not an arrogant person. Like, you're a very humble guy. You're a very cool dude. But it requires a certain level of self-righteousness,
to not believe the official story. I don't think that's true.
I'm not trying to insult you in any way. I'm just saying, like, for you to say that you understand these points better than these professionals, I gotta ask you, please provide to both of them your greatest argument, the best one you have.
I've been trying. So, did you guys see those, that picture I sent of the renovations, the 2002 renovations of it was the under masonry of the Capitol building? It was all dug up. You could see that not only was there the magnificent dome up top and those magnificent white pillars, that underneath there was at least a story or two of what looked like sandstone. Did you guys get a good chance to look at that picture?
What if it was fake?
Well, maybe no. It was you should, if you think it was fake, then maybe look into the 2002 renovation where they did some maintenance and renovation, and they really exposed just how deep the under masonry of the Capitol buildings go, and that was all not built by settlers with wagons. That would really kind of throw a wrench into all of his history.
Built by settlers with wagons at all.
That's the story. It's 1792 to 1800.
At all. Washington, D.C. is one of the marvels of city design by an African-American man, I might add. It's a modern city. When they rebuilt the Capitol after the War of 1812, once it was burned down by the British, they rebuilt and may have added modernized things then, but I assure you it wasn't by settlers in wagons. Settlers went out west. This place has been settled for almost 200 years by the time, actually, no, I take that back. 200 years by the time they rebuilt the thing. It hadn't been there 200 years, but I guess by your argument, maybe it had been.
So the first session of Congress, they tell us, was in 1800. And so, you know, that the Capitol building, that ridiculously big dome, that was built in between 1792 and 1800, they tell us. And yes, in that time, it would have had to have been settlers with wagons. I mean, that's before electricity. What else would have built that if not settlers with wagons?
Okay, I guess wagons is fine in this context. I won't fault you on that. I still use a wagon in my garden every day, for that matter. But no, you're right. Electricity wasn't around at the time, but I think you're going a little bit further back in your thinking on how unadvanced tools were at the time. Because
in 1792?
Yeah, to think that 3,500 years BCE, the pyramids, the Sphinx, underground pyramids for that matter, and that's in one area of the world alone, let alone others. To think that they could build such massive structures with such precision with hand tools. And by the way, if you put, water and material in cracks of stones, no matter how large, and then heat it up, eventually you will crack that stone. And then stones typically by their nature crack on straight lines, which you can then chisel into other straight lines. But that's irrelevant, even with hand tools. I actually found a very cool atlatl head out on my property the other day that was napped. And I'm going to guess it's not brand new and it wasn't made with a Dremel tool. Either way, their building process was, I don't think, as far back as you think it was.
If I can jump in real quick. Marissa Alexa McCool, recently I had a guest on the show, the author of Before Orion, Bernie Taylor, and he was telling me a story where he went to South America. He talked to a tribesman and showed him star charts. And this guy thought that if he went up at the top of a cliff and looked for a star to come over the horizon, that this was some kind of spiritual journey. And then he showed him the star chart, and it totally devastated this man. My question is, maybe what Tyler is pulling his information from isn't that necessarily, like, maybe he's being a little hyperbolic when he says history's fake. Maybe what he's saying is we have abandoned history. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tyler, but maybe the history that happened before us is being convoluted, being confused by modern secularism, by science, as it were. Is that something that you would say, as someone that has studied anthropology, previous cultures have significance, even if they're not necessarily historically or scientifically accurate?
Of course. The study of culture, in my opinion, does not put a weight on technological advancement. That's not the purpose of at least cultural anthropology. I mean, you have a bunch of different branches of anthropology. Cultural would probably be the one that I'm most versed in. You have physical anthropology, which is archaeology, evolution, fossils, things like that. You have linguistic anthropology, which is the history of language and dialect. And you have medical anthropology. So, I mean, even I can only really speak on two of those at best, but the purpose of anthropology is not to say this culture is better than that culture because they're more right about something or they figured out more about this particular science. The purpose of anthropology is to learn about the people. And the instance that you're talking about, an anthropologist would examine what the tribesmen believed and regard that as part of the faith of that particular culture, even if the anthropologist does not make a truth statement on whether or not the star chart is accurate. What the background of anthropology is, it's building. It's like science, and as Mark has spoken, it's building on what is already there and constantly verifying and cross-examining and, seeing different perspectives. The deepest anthropological study one can generally do is called an ethnography, and there are thousands of ethnographies of various different cultures. And while some of the terminology that they used in earlier ones has not aged well, and the white supremacist and cultural xenophobia, shall we say, has not aged well, it doesn't make the observations made necessarily inaccurate. But even though I'm not a history professor, as Mark is, when the challenge is it's once again not on us to provide the proof. So one of my intense studies was the Kwakiutl, which is a native First Nations tribe of Vancouver Island. And the first ethnography done of them was by a man named Franz Boas. But that's not the sole source from which we draw that, because there are other documented interactions with them and tribespeople who became fluent in the languages and was able to communicate history from their perspective and culture from their perspective. So it's an accumulation. It's not one narrative set forth in order to become enshrined in stone of what a culture is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it really does. Tyler, was I giving you a little more credit than deserved whenever I said that maybe you're not saying history's fake. Maybe you're saying modern times have kind of manipulated history because of our own cultural initiatives. In the same sense of, would you accept that a lot of our history, a lot of the people that wrote down what happened were just studying astrology?
Yeah, I mean, I could accept that. Could you guys accept perhaps that there are buildings in America that are older than 300 years old? Is that at all? Because if that was true, if there was even one that was older than 300, that would kind of throw out the whole historical narrative, though, wouldn't it?
No, it would not.
How would they get here if that was before Christopher Columbus landed?
Because Christopher Columbus was a hell of a lot longer than 300 years ago, and he did not reach mainland America, but the Vikings probably did.
He's not referencing the Aztec pyramid structures. He's saying like
the Greco-Roman columns and pillars.
Yeah, he's saying the White House, the Lincoln Memorial, the Statue of Liberty. Am I reading you right, Tyler? You're going full throttle, man. You're doing the
Statue of Liberty.
The Statue of Liberty was here when Christopher Columbus landed on the shore. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it was already here.
And we got it from France, Jack.
Found some Freemasonry.
Why didn't he write about it then?
Maybe he did. We have no idea what he really wrote.
Yeah, we do. We have verified sources and people who have also provided sources, because Columbus was not the only one traveling at that time, nor was he the first.
And he spent a lot of time, sorry to interrupt you, by the way, ma'am. He spent a lot of time broke as hell after his set of voyages. So he had plenty of time to write down his accolades, and consequently did. So, yeah, I think he would have mentioned something like, oh, I came across this bloody huge building that seems like something I've seen before elsewhere.
Giant lady.
Right.
Well, and they based the colonial American government based a lot of their founding principles on Rome. So it's not out of the question or that far of a leap to say that they would model their buildings after Rome. Last time I checked, Rome was around a lot longer than 300 years ago as well. So I'm failing. Please stop interrupting me.
So I feel like I haven't gotten to talk much at all here, but sorry, continue.
Okay, you can wait your turn. Just like I have, just like Mark has. You can wait until we're finished to speak, just like the rest of us do.
Yes, ma'am, sorry.
Thank you.
Tyler, if you can accept that ancient historians were basing their history on stars, can you at least accept that there are things in our firmament that define our culture?
Yeah, definitely.
And would you in turn accept that those stars are real?
Yeah, they're real lights in the sky.
And by lights in the sky, what do you mean?
Like the stars, celestial luminaries. Yes, I agree that has shaped humanity.
Would you accept that they are burning balls of gas far away in the distance of space, millions of miles away?
That doesn't seem to have much to do with history being fake, but no, I don't. I question that as well.
Of course.
I thought the fireflies stuck up in a big bluish black thing.
Well, Tyler, would you accept that in the same way that you reject history, you reject astronomy?
I reject certain parts of history and certain parts of astronomy.
Right. But do you also accept that you are not skilled or trained or educated in the same level as the people that perform these tasks and studying those topics? It's a little crazy that you, as someone that hasn't put in the time and effort, like Marissa or Mark or goddamn NASA, you haven't put in the time, man. How do you justify?
I can explain exactly.
Okay.
How would I justify that? I know that you guys have studied the official story much, much more. However, I think it's possible you haven't really taken the time to think, or much time to think, like, maybe this isn't accurate. Perhaps they invented a story and are pushing a false narrative to hide our real history.
I mean, honestly, and sorry to interrupt you, Tyler, were you to a point that I could break in for a second?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. Thank you. To that point directly, are you familiar, and this is a history teacher thing, so if you're not, this isn't to insult you in any way, primary versus secondary sources?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So for those that aren't, that might listen in, primary, things like letters, documents that were of the period written by people about the event that you're studying or the person that you're studying. Secondary are books that were written by people who read those documents and rendered their opinions. I will admit to you that the secondary sources are far more influenceable by people's biases and opinions. And that's why, as historians, as people who are just passively interested in history even, that is something that is incumbent upon you, the historian, is to back check and fact check yourself by using primary sources. Secondary sources are fine. They guide you towards primary sources frequently. But those sources, that's where the trust comes in. That's what I was talking about, almost like a religion and from a non-religious guy. I get it. Belief is everything. But the primary sources are there to reinforce what people who weren't alive were experiencing. You understand what I'm saying?
Have you seen a lot of primary sources that are actually handwritten, or have you seen things that have only been filtered through the printing presses before?
No. Handwritten is actually much more common for the stuff that I study. I'll do you one better. I mean, if you wanted to go really questionable, you would have to go to verbal histories, unwritten histories, like a lot of African cultures. A lot of the histories there are just told as pure myth, right? Or were told as myth until they were written down. And then historians would pick through that myth, and still do to this day, to find facts as we can interpret them about the people that the myths are spoken of, right? So you might read through one of my ones that I teach, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is not a primary source. The secondary source in its own way. It's written about somebody by another author. It's not written by the person who's Gilgamesh, right? But even though it's myth, you can still, because it's set in its own time when it's written, you can pick through the myth and find things that you only write about at that time, what is in front of you. The great walls of Uruk stand 40 feet tall, or however tall they were. You'll have to forgive me, I don't recall exactly. That's written about in this myth. But when you go back and people have found and studied, anthropologists, archaeologists, all, etc., have gone back and studied what is and where was described to be the city of Uruk. Now, those walls were roughly the right height as in the myth. So that lends credence by going back and assessing that primary and secondary in its own way source by going, okay, even though this was written on clay tablets thousands of years ago, the descriptions that were there, even though mythological in their base and magic doesn't really happen, even though that part of it is untrue, hey, look, we still found this very true wall around this city, exactly where it's supposed to be, and we now have tons of other things that we can study from that. So you see how, I understand the secondary sources, you can question some stuff in those per history's accuracy, but primary sources, if you go with those, it's kind of like was said earlier. If Columbus had seen Greco-Roman style buildings in America, or what would become America, or the colonies first and then America, North America as we see it now, if he had seen Greco-Roman buildings, man, I got to tell you, he would have written about them.
Yeah, because he was Italian, so he probably would have recognized Roman architecture.
And been very proud to see it elsewhere.
And I think what would happen is if he did see it and write about it, that it would be really easy to just edit that out if you were trying to push a fake history.
What would be the motivation of something like that? Because it seems to me it would take a lot more effort to edit someone or something out, and also every other source that ever recorded it, than what is right.
There's a lot of reasons they would lie about our history. For example, how did they really build all this stuff? They don't want us being able to reproduce that. It seems they had free energy back then. Maybe that's what those crosses are on top of all the churches. Maybe they're not really churches. Maybe they're something else. They don't want us knowing any of that. And they lie about everything just because the people who run the world are just kind of sick in the head or something.
See, it's the they and the conspiracy thing that this is where it divides.
The powers that be.
Like, what would you need to see or read or put through your brain in whatever capacity you'd like to believe history as even a cynic teaching history like myself? I teach real history and I pride myself on that. And it can get you into trouble sometimes when you don't just teach by the book. And once you start teaching anthropology, or if you go that route, I apologize, it's going to be the same way. The books are terrible. And Tyler, I'll grant you that. Books for history's purpose in schools until college, are dreck. They're horrid. Okay. So I won't debate you on, you can find inaccuracies in statements in those books, but to question the reality of history, what would you need to see to believe that history happened the way that I studied and the way that, again, not to speak for everyone else in the room, but all three of the other of us seem to believe?
I would like a better breakdown on how exactly all this sandstone and marble was quarried and cut and hauled. And somehow there's some examples of buildings such as the Salt Lake City County building. They tell us it was built in 2 years, and it's just this magnificent castle. And they tell us it was built in 2 years, and right now they're building an apartment building right by where I play a lot of games, and it's one of those just like a huge parking garage and then floors of stores and then 10 stories, and that's taken them 2 years. And they've got bulldozers and cranes and all this and they're just working all the time. And to just the idea that that building was built in 2 years without electricity, I mean, it's just preposterous. I think there is just some examples that are just so absurdly, they prove the official story as not what we're told.
Not at all. Think how many people were around then, and think how many of them were not playing video games. Let me give you a percentage. 0% played video games when that shit was being built. So you don't have a lot of distractions. People worked, man. Like this retirement age nonsense that we've got, this 9 to 5 idea of great work that we have, that's all horse shit. That's brand new, okay? That's industrial revolution.
Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to. One
second. What this is back then is mass production on a scale that you don't even fathom, because to you, a lot of people doing one thing is cheering for a football game in a stadium. That's a lot of people doing one thing. And granted, that's a lot by today's standards, doing one thing uniformly at a time. But think how loud that gets when everyone does one thing. You can increase speed when everyone's doing one thing. That's it, man. Like, it was processed out. It's not like this was the first building they had built. It wasn't their first rodeo. They knew how many people, how many bricks. Hell, Chinese people, not to be derogatory by just calling someone Chinese, but I forget the architect's name. There's a Chinese architect 1,500 years BCE who predicted exactly how many bricks it would take to make a single fort. And he predicted he would have one left over when he requested 1 million bricks. And when that brick was one left over, because he mathed it out just right, even then he was able to cut such precise bricks, and he knew they would turn out. And stonework, all of it, so precisely it would turn out. He could tell you he was going to have one brick left over, and he then had a priest put a blessing on that brick, and it still sits over the lintel of the castle gate right now as a blessing to all who go in and out. That was a long, long time ago, and they were already that precise in building, and you think they would have trouble getting up something with endless manpower, essentially, because, again, you can't sit down and play Fortnite right now. You ain't got it.
They also had, what do they call those people that were forced to work?
Oh, that's right.
Endlessly?
Oh, unpaid laborers, something. Yeah. Oh, gosh. Slaves.
Yeah, they had slaves.
That's right.
So even assuming infinite people, even assuming you've got 1 million people and 2 years, 1 million people ready to go build this, how would you even start quarrying that marble? And it just doesn't make any logical sense to me. Well, especially when you look into Greater Tartaria and all the other structures that are out of place artifacts and out of place structures all over the world.
Build times frequently wouldn't include quarry times, and that's, again, not to deflate your argument entirely, but just know that, when they say build time, 2 years, that thing was being planned for 15 probably beforehand.
Mm-hmm. And the materials were sourced, and the foundations were dug, and the maps were made, and the blueprints, everything. And I also want to say, just because it's hard for you to understand does not mean it's fake.
Yeah. I mean, I'm obviously aware of that. But I still feel like I still haven't gotten much of a good description on how this was actually done. You tell me that, this Chinese man was close to, within one brick.
Yes.
But how were just the logistics of how all these bricks work? Where were they fired? How were they hauled? Just when you actually start looking into that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's actually still villages along the original Great Wall of China that still to this day carry on the practices of their ancestors and fire replacement bricks for the original wall in the exact same way from the exact same clay just to maintain the sake of. So how you get the bricks there is you make them on site. Bricks ain't hard. How do you get sandstone cut? It's not hard. We've had bronze since, Utsi the Iceman died, I think 5000 BCE, something like that.
Oh my God.
So,
was that guy the guy that died and he was like an iced body with an arrow in his back?
Yeah, Utsi the Iceman of the Alps.
So awesome. Like he had little trinkets and his purse. And then we found the arrow in his back and his arm stretched back trying to pull it out. And he froze that way. And that's our oldest moment of history. Violence.
Yeah. And again, I'd like to add for my own personal, gratification, he had tattoos that many years ago. So come on, let's make him okay in society, please.
Yeah. Well, I think this generation's cool with tattoos.
Welcome to teaching. It's still a tenuous path.
It's a beautiful story. Historically, we always regarded him as someone that was a patron of free trade. And then when we thawed him out, we found out he was a victim of human violence. And that's the history of human civilization. Tyler, could you at least agree that whether or not history is real or fake, that humans seem to have a history of inherent violence?
Yeah, we don't really know, actually.
Oh my.
Well, I feel like we do. I mean, Mark just referenced it.
Yeah, but if history was reset, often and as recently as 1850.
Like the Matrix style reset? Like we just pulled the plug and plugged back in and we all ate the blue pill?
More like natural disasters, perhaps man-made or not, and just resetting.
Or not. That's again, like people predate, like still living people now remember people that remember people. It's like the 6 degrees of know your fucking history. Like people of this generation shook hands with the last generation who remembers the last generation who shook hands with the last generation. That gets us back to your pre-calamity times. Was there just a mass, again, like not to make pop culture references, but Men in Black Flash going on here that we just all forgot?
No, I think that they just started teaching false things in school and that everyone just kind of went with that and it just kind of all got lost. There's a lot of old, really old, they're like insane asylums. They used to have a lot of insane asylums back in the old days.
Still do.
And perhaps that was, perhaps that was a large part about getting rid of people who could remember the old stuff.
Well, it was a great way to get rid of people that you didn't like in society, but I'm not entirely sure that I'll go as far as what you think. Look, man, you're too far in conspiracy land for this one. Again, I go back to what do you need to see to believe other than something that a stonemason could explain better than a historian?
I want to see an example of anything like this being reproduced in modern times. It seems like we just can't even get anywhere close to this nowadays.
We just don't.
Right.
I mean, it's prohibitively expensive, and even if you could do it, you need such heavy machinery. I think it's literally impossible to build so many of these buildings, and just the fact that these buildings exist disproves much of history.
No, it doesn't. Because for proof, you need proof. You need proof of something like that. And we don't have any sources of anyone who predates these buildings talking about these buildings. And yeah, we can say there was some kind of big reset, but there's no proof. There is no evidence. And when you study any kind of science, any kind of academic study, it is based on the consistency, cross-examination, cross-reference of multiple primary and secondary sources. It's an accumulation. There isn't just, oh, maybe this happened. There are people who study one battlefield their entire lives. So in order to even start with everything reset at 1850, we would have to find sources older than 1850 that spoke of these things, and to orchestrate some kind of mass cover-up of going beyond just our civilization, all of the native civilizations, all of the people who traveled through these civilizations would be so unbelievably complicated and widespread that it seems far more likely to me that cross-verified sources from different cultures and people and traveling groups being consistent within each other are a lot more likely to be true than nuh-uh.
Yeah, and I agree with that, definitely. I feel you on that so much. But then, even though there's no quote-unquote sources, we have these out-of-place things, such as there are cities that have just entire, it's like a whole city was just covered like in a foot, like 1 story of mud, and you can...
Tyler,
yeah.
Before the mud thing, let me ask you this. I want to go back to like before Christ, or before the Common Era. 276 to 194 BC, Eratosthenes. This is Hellenistic time. He discovered the earth was round.
2 things about Eratosthenes. First off, I'm not sure that he even existed, to be honest.
Of course not.
Second off, if you would hear Neil deGrasse Tyson will actually admit that his experiment would also work on a flat earth with a small sun directly overhead. Neil deGrasse Tyson will admit that. So the whole story in itself is suspicious because it's told in one of the few ways that would work on both models.
That I'd carry a purse if I was a woman. What you'll admit to and what's true are 2 different things. So Neil deGrasse Tyson says something would work on a flat earth in those circumstances does not mean in any shape, form, or fashion, and I am going to speak for Neil deGrasse Tyson on this one, that he believes the planet is flat in any way.
Yeah, of course he doesn't believe that.
Do you believe the earth is flat? Yes or no?
I think it's more of a realm. I don't think it has a shape.
Where's your proof?
Oh, deity.
Well,
Tyler, would you also say that you do not believe that space is real?
I do not believe in outer space, no.
Let me ask you this. Would you at least accept that the star charts of our ancestors predicted the movements of stars in such a way that they have historical significance? Whether or not you say space is real or the earth is round.
Oh, yeah,
or flat,
definitely. The sky is a clock, and it says all sorts of stuff. I definitely hear that.
But doesn't their historical reference of how the stars move, whether it be in a certain summer solstice or what have you, would you at least accept that those people were recording history accurately? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm sure they recorded history accurately, but has what they recorded been accurately shown to us is the part. That's the step that I'm calling potential shenanigans.
What is the filter? Is it some kind of like weird, Bush to 9/11 thing? Is it like the powers that be? Is it the Rothschild? Like what is the difference, man? It seems like you accept ancient wisdom, but you reject modern science. And I'm wondering, where is this divide? Because Marissa's education doesn't show that divide. Mark's education, what he's teaching, doesn't show that divide. And I'm asking, what divide do you see and how can you prove it?
I see a divide between what we're told and what is possible within the historical record and just mainstream everything. I think that academia has been kind of hijacked by people that want to keep us wrong about everything.
I feel like I would have run into some of these people, given that I went to the same university as the current president. I feel like when I was studying for one of my 3 degrees at the University of Pennsylvania, I would have encountered somebody who was like, hey, all this is bullshit, but you have to learn it so you can get your special piece of paper. Once again, no matter what topic we're going on, it seems like your argument is, nuh-uh, because it's mainstream or because it's official or sources are in quotes. It really seems like you're just trying to go against the grain to be smarter than everybody else. And
science is fake, history is fake, the history of science is fake, the science of history is fake. Nuh-uh.
We can just see so many examples of them being wrong with it, and it just, it puts it all into question.
No, it doesn't. People are wrong. Yeah. Is there consistency in this wrongness? Are there documented evidence sources of these people being wrong? No. People would have figured that. People would have figured this. People would have figured this out by now. People are not stupid. They would not just accept all of these inconsistencies, and there would be evidence.
Wouldn't they?
There would be.
Who is behind this delusion? This intentional manipulation of people's consciousness? What do you think is the source?
It seems that there's a sort of it's almost like a cult of occult elitists that are kind of behind everything.
Elitist. So it's money. It's all about money. It's not.
And you ain't in it.
And I mean, no disrespect here, but You don't think it's like lizard people or aliens or transdimensional beings, as it were? Like, I'm not trying to mock you. I'm just saying, like, I'm trying to understand. Like, are you saying at the root of this, it's just currency?
At the root of it, I don't really know. All I know at the root of it is obvious lies. And we're being lied to, and figuring out who was lying and why is a lot harder than seeing that what we're being told doesn't line up with what we're experiencing and seeing.
So you're smarter than all of us.
I think I may be just a little bit more skeptical to what I'm told.
That's kind of a very, very broad assumption to take.
No, that's a fair question, Tyler. Marissa asked a very important question. Do you think you are smarter or more righteous? Do you think that you hold a higher moral virtue or a higher moral intellectuality than your superiors academically?
I don't think so. I don't think that I am higher. I don't think there are superiors, though. To be honest, I think that you have access to all the same information I do. Then what right do you have to question them? So you say that accepted things, I see that as kind of almost like a religion that does need to be verified. And that
it's a hell of a lot more verified than what you're saying.
Yeah, except for there are certain things, such as the DC undermasonry, that just kind of destroy the official story. And I hope you guys look into Tartaria and mud flood resets a little bit more when you get some time. The reason we started talking about this...
It's funny that Tartaria is actually named after some tablets that proved to be historically apocryphal by their nature. So it's funny to me that your historical theory on the fact that history is false is named after something that has been proven in history to be abject bullshit.
I also love that there's somehow a monolith and an official story that we're all subscribed to, as if Mark and I would come to the exact same conclusion on every question, as if there's just one story that we're all researching the answer to, and it's just an accumulation of people who accept that passively and aren't skeptical about anything. It is absolutely absurd to insult us that way, to think that we are so blinded by this cult of academia, and using even George Carlin to quote it as if he would believe someone who says the earth is flat and outer space isn't real. You're arguing against people who have done these things and studied these things and verified sources, as I have said. And your argument is, nuh-uh, I don't think so. And just because it's very hard for you to understand and accept does not make it invalid. And it doesn't make us some kind of blind sheep playing with these elite superiors. Because I guarantee I went to school with these elite superiors. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, who hangs out with Harvard and Yale and the rest of them. I had a class with Tiffany Trump, okay? I've been with these elite people, and they may be...
You really had Tiffany Trump in your class?
Yes. And Donald Trump was at the graduation a year before mine, which is why I didn't go to my own, because I didn't think I wanted to be in the same building as the person about whom I wrote "fuck you" in my first book. The point is, I have been with these elite people, and they may be socially oblivious and well-intended, but coming up short in understanding a lot of social ills. But the idea that it's all some part of a massive cover-up of academic studies is ludicrous. And again, there's no proof. There is absolutely no proof. You're saying obvious lies, but you're not giving any concrete...
please don't call me a liar. There is definitely proof.
Excuse me, if you interrupt me one more time, I am leaving this call.
You called me a liar.
I did not call you a liar.
Okay.
Just if I can jump in real quick, Mark, if you don't mind, closing us out with your closing statement, and then Marissa follow up after that, and then Tyler, I'd love to hear your closing arguments.
Sure. I think my closing statement is more of just something that if I could get Tyler to address this in his closing time, that would be great. Tyler, what do you believe is fact? I mean, what evidence convinced you that this is fact? Also, just future reference points, skeptic and denying everything and claiming superiority, not the same thing. Ask him to define, or ask you rather, that's what I got my note to say, to define the words that you use in what you call fact in your evidence as closely as you can, as well as you can, if you would please.
I think that there's very few things that I would consider fact, and the very few things are things that I can personally verify, and that's about it.
All right, I appreciate that. Tyler, like, history is more than just what you think it is. The questions you have seem much more appropriate to a stonemason than to a historian or an anthropologist. If your confusion comes about how stone was cut in olden days, then talk to them. Like I said, it's a series of facts that even though you might not have been present for them, you can trace them back. Like I said, kind of like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon in history, you know, but it goes back further than 1800s, which if we're just trying to poke one little hole in everybody's argument, that's my hole in yours. Because if yours is 1800, I got history that can go back further in handshakes.
I'm sorry to act like I know more than you guys. I did not mean to do that. However, when you look at a few specific examples, such as the World's Fairs, D.C., San Francisco, and the Salt Lake City temples, it seems that is just beyond logistically impossible. And the fact, just if even one of these, Greco-Roman style buildings was already here, 300 or 500 years ago, that seems to throw all of history into question. And I hope you guys look into mud flood research and Tartaria a bit more, because I think there is proof, and it's all around us all the time. You can see these completely ridiculous buildings that we could not produce today. And there's many of them still standing.
The argument seems to be that we were not technologically advanced enough to build buildings that were built in the same style 2,000 years earlier. I cannot accept an argument of, well, just look around. And I especially cannot accept the religiosity of an argument that is, if one thing's wrong, everything is into question, because there is no monolith. There is no official story. There is what people who have studied and verified have gained from the people who have studied it before. It is an accumulation, and one thing being inaccurate or improved on does not throw everything out. The Romans and the American people of the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries were not the first people to build stuff like this. Stuff like this was being built 2,000 years ago. It was being built not just in Europe and not just in North America, but by the Mayan civilization, by the Aztec civilization, by the Incas, by the Egyptians. This doesn't go back 200 years. This goes back thousands of years. And we've talked about 4 or 5 different disciplines in this conversation that you are skeptical of. 2 of them have been studied by the people who are present, and the argument seems to be what you learned is just not true because of some massive cover-up. And I am unwilling to accept that. We've somehow been blinded by some hypothetical that there's some group out there just trying to blind us into thinking what it is, because even within certain documents, there are people who disagree. There is not an official story. There is not a monolith, but nuh-uh is not an argument. And just because it's impossible for you to understand logistically or otherwise in something that you admit you don't know very much about doesn't make it impossible, doesn't make it unreasonable, and doesn't make it a lie.
My story, it's all you know.
Thank you to Marissa, Mark, and Tyler. Thank you to Dave Blair at davefreesong.com/free music. Thank you to Brent Lee from the Unapologetics podcast for our closing music. Find his show and our show notes as well. Thank you to our patrons, all you freeloaders, which I still love. Keep listening and fighting. However, you also can support this broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, we'll be talking to Andrew Seidel about his new book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Between now and then, remember that you have the right to reason.
Right to reason. Your 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 right to reason.